Now, the kickoff today, we're very excited, cutting through the noise with Grist and Project Drawdown. At the end of this conversation, we'll take questions from the audience. You have cards on your seat. Please write your name concisely and a concise, legible question, and we'll get to as many as we can. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome our lead-off guests. Jonathan Foley is Executive Director of Project Drawdown. Many of you may know him from his time here at the Cal Academy in San Francisco. Key communicator, leader on climate and sustainability, and has been on the show a number of times. We're really happy to have him back. And Nikhil Swaminathan is CEO of Grist, one of the largest climate-focused newsrooms in the country. Their journalism is rooted in finding real solutions at the intersection of climate and justice. And they're essential resources here for Climate One, and I bet for you too. They'll be in conversation with Climate One's new co-host, Kousha Navidar. Please welcome them to Climate One.
For joining us. The bad news is that Greg used up all the t-shirts, so I have none to throw to you. But I got something better. I got two great guests, John and Nikhil. Thank you both so much for joining us on Climate One.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, John, fun fact, I know that before you got into climate, when you were a kid, you wanted to be an astronomer.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what changed? What brought you to the climate world?
Well, yeah, as a little kid, I grew up in rural Maine, and one of the beautiful things about living out in the countryside is seeing the Milky Way at night and the aurora and the stars up ahead. And I was a science nerd, and I wanted to understand that, and so went to school studying that. But after a while, realized those other planets are going to be fine until Elon gets to them. But in the meantime, they're fine. This one's not. And so I decided in college, let's turn that telescope around and focus kind of the science I was interested in on how this planet works and what's so special about it, and how we at this moment in history really have to be called upon to be better stewards of this planet and for our own sake, above anything else.
Yeah.
And so that's turns out being an astronomer could actually be useful someday.
Yeah, the telescope can turn around too.
Can.
That's a fun fact about telescopes. And Nikhil, I know that for you, you studied chemical engineering, right? So what took you from there to journalism?
Probably not being a great chemical engineer. I studied chemical engineering. I'm the son of Indian immigrants, so that was sort of expected. And you can talk to my dad about how he felt about my switch into journalism. So
felt great.
I mean, he's okay with it now,
Yeah,
but
sure.
there was a long, tough 10 years in there. But it was just finding my own curiosity and the fact that I was curious about so many different things, and journalism really allows you to think about and write about and become an expert for a year or a few months or even a week in something. And so I used my scientific background to become a science journalist and went from writing about everything from biology and neuroscience to then climate.
I find that so interesting because you've been in the game for a while, and for me, I'm wondering how you've seen climate reporting change over the years from when you started till today.
I think it was largely a scientific pursuit. So I was at Scientific American in 2007, 2008. And I remember I wasn't the one writing the climate stories. I was working on health and neuroscience work. And I remember going over to the climate reporter and saying, look, 1 week you're writing a story about how sea level rise is going to be 4 feet, and the next week it's 5 feet, and the next week. And I was like, I don't mean to be a jerk, but I get that it's going to rise. Does it really matter?
Right.
At that point? And I am losing track of this. And so when I came to Grist, I realized that I was working in this newsroom that was about how climate was affecting people, how people were responding to climate. And it becomes much more of a human-centric story and less of the latest paper in Nature, the latest paper in Science, the latest paper in Proceedings on from the National Academy of Sciences, and more about, this is how climate change affects your grocery prices. This is how high school football teams can't practice in August because of how hot it is. Really bringing the conversation that is atmospheric and bringing it to the level of lived experience.
John,
And
do you feel like
that's more powerful?
Do you feel like that change has happened as well in your work? Because at Drawdown, you do a lot of storytelling as well. Has that human-centric focus been a big part of your work?
Well, yeah, I think in the last 30 years, a lot of the climate conversation has changed partly because of Mother Nature. It's no longer an abstract notion that, well, it might change in the future. It's changing now, right in front of us. So it's actually, I think, nature is a better science communicator than we are in the science world sometimes. So that's one thing that's changed. But also, I think we've gotten better at kind of bringing it home to the kitchen table issues that people really care about. And talking about abstract notions like how many parts per million in the atmosphere, what the hell does global average temperature mean? Nobody lives there.
Yeah.
I don't know where that is,
Right.
but I do know where San Francisco is and what's happening to my kids, what's happening to the air I breathe, to the weather patterns here, what's happening to fires and landslides and things. So it's kind of bringing it home to the real here and now.
Yeah.
And that enables a whole different, much more compelling conversation with everybody, not just scientists and policy wonks. And I think that's where we need to go much more, is, tell real stories.
It's tough though, right? Because
Yeah.
there's a balance there. I mean, we're talking about something that we at Climate One do every week, and you want to be factual. You want to make sure that you are equipping people with knowledge to have the right context, and
Sure.
it's hard to find that balance. So I guess for Nikhil, you do this every day. How do you find that balance then?
I think at this point, everything we do is driven by the science. The science is behind everything, right? If you want to write for Grist or report for Grist, you have to understand climate science. But that's all operating in the background, as John said, like you're seeing wildfires, you're seeing hurricanes. This has become a part. There was a period of time where we're talking about climate change as this distant,
Right.
threat. And now we're talking about it as a lived experience. We're talking about, it's ungodly hot in Chicago and they're opening cooling centers because a big percentage of the population in the South Side doesn't have air conditioning. And you're able to not only see, it is unlivable outside, but there's actually parts of our society who are suffering more than others. And that part of the story is the part that's going to impact people. I think the other thing that we find is like Grist has moved into more like local news over the years. And so where we can connect to people's identity and tie that to what's happening in the climate, like, you can't hunt and fish in the places that you used to.
I think that is such an interesting perspective, specifically on local news reporting, because I work for I've worked with New York City's NPR affiliate, for instance, right? And it's all about, with local, you can bring it to what's happening right in your community, right in front of you. What does Grist do to help focus on that local perspective?
So we do two really big things. One is we syndicate our content maniacally, I think is the verb I would use. Anybody who will take it, we treat it as a public good. We'll move it anywhere. We're happy when Time Magazine picks it up. We're happy when Wired picks it up. We're especially happy when the Stevens Point Journal in Wisconsin picks it up, and other, small newspapers around the country, because they have ideologically diverse audiences that you cannot create anymore. And we also work with local newsrooms to place local news reporters. Sometimes they're Grist employees, sometimes they're employees of the outlet, because we want to be able to increase the resolution with which Grist is reporting on climate, and create a drumbeat of stories for a local audience. But it also allows us to tell a sharper image, to paint a sharper image of the climate story for a national audience. So that's a place where we can have our reporter in northern Michigan talk about I bet you didn't know this, but Traverse City, Michigan is the cherry capital of the world. I didn't know that, but that's what they...
I learned something new.
Yeah, that's how they talk about Traverse City, Michigan. I've never been there. It's the cherry capital of the world. Look it up. So climate change, changed the patterns of how the winter was in the early spring, decimated the crop this year. And our local reporter told a story about the drop in the cherry harvest. And that's something that connects to people's lived identity, to where they live, to what's important to their community. And who cares if climate change is in the bottom half of the article? You've already touched them in an emotional center, and then that's the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down.
Spoonful of sugar. Also, you're making that bridge, right,
Yeah.
between the context and the personal. And we're here to talk about as well solutions. So I want to get into the solutions part of the conversation too. John, for you, what solutions really excite you right now in the climate world?
Well, the good news about climate solutions is that we have so many. We have everything we need, by the way, right now already to solve climate change. We don't need to invent anything new to actually stop this problem. It would help to invent some new things to make them cheaper, faster, better. That's great. But we do have what we need. So our choice is that. It's still a choice about the future. Do we want to have a lot of climate change or do we not? That choice has not been taken away from us at all. So we make a good choice here. So I'm excited about that, first of all. But most of all, I'm excited by the kind of low-tech solutions that offer a lot of other benefits. Sure, we could end up addressing climate change, but the great news about addressing climate change is we also build a better world in the process. That's kind of awesome, isn't it? Imagine going to the doctor, and they're like, wow, you're really sick, and I'm going to give you this medicine, and its side effects are you're going to feel better. That's it. You're going to feel better.
You're going to grow 6 inches.
Yeah, you'll feel better. You'll be taller. You're going to be better looking. You're going to have more money in your wallet. I mean, like, wow, this
I'll
is
take it.
great. Yeah,
I'll take it.
So climate solutions are like that, and so I like the kind of low-tech solutions that, like, hey, this saves money, this cleans the air, this creates jobs. These are incredible things. But I think we're focused a lot on a couple of sectors. We focus so much on electricity because I think people understand plugging something in at the end of a wire is either coal or a solar panel. Okay, that's understandable, but that's only a quarter of climate change. The things that keep me up at night about climate change are actually other sectors like food. Food contributes a third of our greenhouse gas emissions, but it only gets 3% of our climate funding, and a lot less climate reporting, except at Grist and Climate One. You guys do it well. But a lot of places don't even mention it. So we got to think about that. We also have to think about industry. There are a whole bunch of things that we don't know how to solve yet exactly in like cement, steel, landfills, wastewater treatment. Those are things that actually have nothing, those won't be solved with a solar panel, an EV, or a heat pump. So there's some sectors that are doing really well, some others that need more attention, and I'm excited about some of those solutions. And finally, I'm really excited about what I like to call the emergency brake climate solutions, the ones that are especially fast, because we're kind of falling behind the pace we need to be doing to avoid really bad climate change, but we could catch up if we focused on the fastest solutions, things that deal with methane in particular, because methane's a fast-acting greenhouse gas, but also things that deal with deforestation, because deforestation emits all of its carbon at once. So when you prevent deforestation, all of the benefit of stopping deforestation happens on day one. A solar panel, you got to wait 30 years for it to give you all of its impact, but on deforestation, you get it all today. So these kind of emergency brakes, if we pull those really hard, things like methane, refrigerants, black carbon, deforestation, those kind of solutions, those might be able to kind of steer us back on track by catching up a little bit. And we need to put a lot more money and attention on those solutions.
So I'm hearing like low tech, I'm hearing the right industry at the right pace, the emergency brake that you're talking about. I'm sure there are big promises that are made in right? I'm thinking like carbon capture, for instance. How much does it actually work? But there's a lot of support in it. You must look at different proposals, different ideas all the time. At Project Drawdown, how do you kind of differentiate between greenwashing, I guess I would call it, and things that actually hold promise?
Well, we try to be very, very careful because we are a science-based, neutral, nonpartisan, non-commercial. We're trying to be the Consumer Reports for climate change because we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar problem, maybe we ought to know what we're doing. Might be helpful to know what works and what doesn't, right? And so we look really carefully at the evidence, not just our studies, we look at everybody's studies. We synthesize every paper ever written in science, engineering, technical, economic literature, all the data, and bring it together and say, hey, does this actually work? And if so, how much would it cost? And how long would we have to wait for it? And when you crunch the numbers, you just find some stuff just doesn't work. Most of the carbon capture schemes being proposed, at least the industrial carbon capture schemes, just, one, they defy like laws of thermodynamics. They just don't work at all. Or they're like a fig leaf for oil companies, basically, because they're, the carbon, whatever carbon they capture, actually is used to pump more oil and gas out of the ground. And so these things just are crazy most of the time when you look at them, with a few exceptions. There might be a few ideas that could work pretty well, but mostly not.
Yeah.
And we also see a lot of other kind of high-tech, shiny objects being thrown our way, especially in places like San Francisco with a big kind of tech community.
Yeah.
The tech bros are great sometimes, but it'd be helpful if you kind of stopped and learned the science about what you're doing instead of just pitching something you don't know much about. And so could we really... I hear a little quiet applause out there.
I hear snaps.
Yeah. But no, we need new technologies sometimes, of course, and better technologies that make things practical and more affordable and more equitable. That's great. But waiting for the worst possible thing to do is wait for some future tech solution that isn't going to arrive. A friend of mine once said, if your house is on fire, you grab the hose. You don't talk about, let's disrupt the fire suppression business, no, grab the bloody hose, And if new technologies come along in the future years, great, we'll put them in the toolbox. But in the meantime, we have to get going, and waiting is the worst possible thing to do. We talk a lot about the time value of carbon, kind of like the time value of money. Like, you don't wait to save for your retirement until 64. You hopefully start it in your 20s and 30s and start building a little bit over time, and eventually it builds up to a big impact. Same thing with climate solutions. Start now, every day, just chip away at it, and it accumulates a bigger impact.
Nikhil, when John said the fire hose metaphor, I heard you go, yeah. What did that bring up for you?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of conversation around technological solutions, and it doesn't surprise me that if you spend any amount of time with an IPCC report, you kind of come out of it being like, we need it all, like everything. That's kind of true, but you can't bank on some sort of future disruption of the fire of the hose.
Yeah.
You also have to use the tools that are available to you right now. And I think John just mentions a lot of smart ones. Like, look, methane is so much in the short term is so much more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. You plug abandoned oil wells. You figure out ways to give industry what they need to make sure that natural gas isn't leaking through natural gas pipelines. You address food waste. Maybe not the way New York City is by penalizing landlords, but carrots are great. Sticks, good luck. But at least at the residential level. But I think there's this whole suite of phases that we have to go through that I think as a society, we haven't even sort of taken the first step collectively. You have these corners of I remember I used to live here in Oakland, and we had curbside composting, and now I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm like, what do I do with all this? I have 2 children. They generate intense amounts of food waste. And I eat some of it, but I can't eat all of it.
Out of the garbage? Or?
No. Whatever they leave on their plates.
Yeah.
So, we pay extra for a composting solution. But that's so low-hanging fruit. It's it is the lowest of the low-hanging fruit in terms of what we as a society could be working towards. Who out there is against taking food out of a household or a restaurant that's not used and giving it to people who need it, or composting it, or using it in your garden or whatever? feels totally apolitical to me. So why can't we at least get out of the door with that? And then we can worry about carbon capture and direct air capture and all that stuff later. There's just so much in front of us that are first order solutions to the problem. And we have to find a way to talk about them that are, it's almost harder to get it to happen at a national level because it started in Seattle and San Francisco, because then people in Atlanta will be like, no, that's what
That's
they
not
do
me.
over there.
Yeah. John, it sounded like you wanted to hop in there, yeah?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so many bloody missed opportunities that are like kind of duh, and I often say, like, stopping climate change is at least 1/3. Stop doing stupid stuff, like throwing 40% of the food on this planet is never eaten. That's absurd, and we can compost some of it better yet, prevent it in the first place. But, I've never met anybody from the pro-food waste lobby. Maybe they're out there. I've not run into yet. But I think we can agree on that. Or, can we insulate the attics of senior citizens in America to help them reduce their energy bills or something? Would that be a good thing to do? Could we, maybe, just stop being so wasteful on energy, materials, food, land, et cetera? Like, can we agree on that, maybe? And I think the answer is actually yes. And, there's just so many kind of duh things, and they're all just waiting for us. But we haven't actually been very strategic about climate solutions. We've been smearing peanut butter on toast evenly. We're not really designing climate solutions to the local level. Like, what would be the most appropriate things to do in Atlanta versus Oakland? It turns out it's a very different mix of things. So how do we kind of bring it home to the local level where actually most stuff actually really happens, instead of circling the beltway all the time and pretending that's where all the action's happening too? Yeah. And I think we need to bring these solutions to be practical, not confrontational and kind of duh, but localized, and empower local climate leaders to take them on without the political baggage, but also tailored to that specific strategic location.
I'll give one other example, which I think has kind of cut through our current political sadness. And that's there's the burgeoning right to repair movement, and the ability for people to make their electronic devices last 1 year longer, 2 years longer. The waste from those contributes to climate change, and being able to hang on to them for a little bit longer, try to fix it yourself. It's powerful, and Ohio is taking it up now, and that is an example of something where it's cutting. If people want to save that money anyway, they don't want to buy another $1,000 iPhone, or I guess it got accepted from the tariffs, but it was going to be even $2,000 iPhone. Sure. And maybe it still will. So these right to repair movements are really important. Why don't we have a right to repair movement for food waste? Why don't we have it for, deforestation? All of these first order solutions. Let's do them and just get going.
Well, I also
I don't feel they have to be necessarily tied to climate change. Right to repair can be your right to not have to give in to planned obsolescence. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I also hear, John, in what you're saying, and this touches on what you're saying as well, this localized approach, which I think everyone could agree on. So my next question is, what's getting in the way then? And this is for both of you. What's getting in the way of putting these? Yeah, Nikhil, go ahead.
I actually think, we are in the middle of this conversation in a different context right now, global versus local. Globalization is evil. It took away the jobs in this locality, ipso facto tariffs. And it's a similar kind of conversation around climate change. There's a macro and there's a micro. And the macro is there's too much carbon in the atmosphere. And the micro is, I live in Kentucky and it floods, I don't, but other people do. And it floods every 2 years, biblically floods. And that didn't used to happen. I live in California. There are wildfires. I live in Georgia. There are extreme heat days. It looks different everywhere. The solutions are a little different everywhere, as he said earlier, difference between Oakland and Atlanta. And if you let climate be too much of a global issue, then it allows China to take care of it, or India to get its act together, or Africa to not develop the way that we developed. But if you make it a local issue, then it's about jobs in your economy. It's about lowering your electricity bills. It's about creating freedom. Guess what? You put solar panels on your roof, you get to, kind of thumb your nose at your utility. There's just all these ways of talking about how you can improve a local economy that are climate forward. But if you spend too much time talking about it as a global issue, then there are other people who can step in and solve it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was thinking of an example we talked about backstage a little bit. So I used to live in San Francisco for about 6 years. And then I moved back to Minnesota, where I lived before. And then I ended up moving to a very rural part of Minnesota, which is overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump and is full of Republicans. And my San Francisco friends just couldn't believe it. They're like, "Oh my God, how can you live there? How do you talk about climate change where you live now in that deep red county?" I'm like, actually, it's a hell of a lot easier than it was in San Francisco. Because here people were all kind of posing and being kind of signaling each other about how virtuous they were about climate change, but not actually doing as much sometimes. Sorry, but talk is one thing, but walking the walk is the other. But where I lived later, I didn't lead with climate change, but people would often ask, "So, hey, what do you do for a living?" I'm like, "Well, I try to work on things that help communities be thriving, how to create jobs and how to lower the cost of living and how to create more thriving communities in addressing the climate problem we have around the world and to make sure places like our part of Minnesota are competitive in the global economy moving forward and that we move forward in a 21st century economy." And people look at me like, yeah, I'm really interested in that. Tell me more. And these are people who probably wouldn't vote the same way as I do, but they certainly wanted to hear about jobs. They wanted to hear about stronger communities because we're watching rural America feel left behind and die on the vine. That's why people are so angry. You talk about opportunity, you talk about jobs, you bring it down to the kitchen table. They're right there with you. Yeah. And it's kind of interesting as I felt like, and look at where most of the renewable energy projects are. Look at where funding for clean energy goes in this country. It's red counties in red states because that's where the sun is. That's where the power lines are. That's where the geothermal will be. That's where the wind is. And so I think we don't have to have this, Washington-dominated, UN-dominated conversation of left versus right. That's a media invention. In the real world, you get down to the kitchen table, people don't actually talk like that. They care about their communities, they care about their kids, and if you meet them where they are and talk about these issues in a respectful way and listen, you find you can have a great conversation and move forward at the local level. And I really, really think that's what we've been kind of missing, is maybe we need to provide a lot more context of how to have local conversations that really hit home locally. Like, how does this benefit you here and what do we do? And don't lead with carbon, lead with jobs, lead with quality of life, lead with health, communities, kids, things like that.
I hear so clearly this emphasis on local, on meeting people where they are. Mm-hmm. There's nuance to solutions too. Like there's reality, right? And I want to talk about that for a second. At Project Drawdown, I'm sure that you see this every single day. Mining, for instance, lithium, cobalt, linked to human rights violations. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Simultaneously, seems like it's necessary for us to mine those essential items in order to get off of fossil fuels eventually. So what do you make of that? How do you balance the good? Because you talk about this prescription drug that'll make you grow to 6 feet, which would be great for me, and then you're able to dunk on everybody at basketball. There are side effects to it, right?
Yeah. Well, that's one that's brought up a lot is the challenges of batteries. So which you brought up too. So we hear a lot about that, like cobalt, lithium, these other materials that things like batteries are made out of. That yes, we absolutely need to address the kind of human rights and environmental issues related to mining these rare earth materials. Absolutely, no question about this. This, by the way, is a very solvable problem. $1 billion or so would solve it, period. Nothing will solve the fossil fuel problem. You can't solve that without destroying the planet, basically. So compare one where we have untold, unmitigatable damage forever versus a problem we could solve if we weren't so damn greedy. And by the way, cobalt is primarily used in fossil fuel mining, not in our batteries. that's a little lie the fossil fuel industry doesn't want you to hear about. But it turns out that most of the cobalt isn't used in your batteries. And also, we didn't invent batteries to solve the climate problem. Look at your phones, look at your laptops. They've been around a long time. So we have a real problem here. And fossil fuels aren't just contributing to climate change. The air pollution associated with fossil fuels alongside CO2, but the particulate matter, the soot, and the smog that are produced by burning fossil fuels contributes to about 8 or 9 million deaths every single year. So fossil fuels are estimated to kill 8 to 9 million people a year on this planet. Wow. That's more than all the tobacco deaths, gun deaths, and warfare deaths combined. So let's compare that versus mining. Now, mining is dirty, it's messy, it's horrible the way we do it right now, only because we're greedy. So let's solve that. And we shouldn't shy away from that. We should not ignore that. But we can solve that if we put a little bit of money and some better regulations around this and also some good engineering. We also only have to mine those once, and they will never have to be mined again. But coal and oil and gas, you keep on mining, you keep on dying.
Yeah. Nikhil, I want to get your perspective on that, because reporting on these solutions, I'm sure, requires a lot of nuance. I'm thinking of Unearthed, the mining issue from Grist, a series that looks at exactly kind of what John is discussing. How do you make sense of that dilemma in reporting?
I think what was important about the mining issue, and I think what's important about all solutions reporting, is that you have to understand that every decision that you make is a trade-off decision. And a lot of times when we talk about climate action and we talk about the energy transition, we talk about everything about creating a more sustainable planet, we allow ourselves to talk about it in a way that involves magical thinking. And I think it's really important to say, okay, if we move away from fossil fuels and we move towards more solar panels, the energy transition, then we have to reckon with the mining problem. And one way to do that is to do more battery recycling so that you can pull those minerals out again and reuse them, but exactly what John was talking about. So what was important to me about the mining issue was, like, we were looking at the fact that we are, those people who want to bring about the energy transition, which I think is probably everybody in this room, we are talking about a future that involves these minerals. And these are the realities of the minerals, and we might as well deal with them. And hopefully in the way that John talked about, like, safer mining, recycling them more actively. Similarly, the main refrigerant in heat pumps is actually, much like methane, in the short term, a really intense greenhouse gas. So yes, it's like overall more efficient, we're using less electricity, et cetera, but we have to fix the refrigerant too. And solar panel waste is an issue. And so we have to deal with that. And there are issues around wind turbines. So, like, anytime you're talking about this, you have to be honest about what the trade-off is. I mean, induction stoves are awesome. I have one at home. I can, boil water in 90 seconds or less. That trick never gets old. Guess what? You want to make something in a wok on your induction stove?
Tough.
It's not, you don't get that char that you get from gas, That's a reality. It's a trade-off. For me, I don't care. I can't use a wok anyway. So
you're eating your kids' leftovers anyway.
I'm eating, half-eaten peanut butter sandwiches.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
There's a joke about walking the walk here.
Oh, nice. You heard it on Climate One, on school lore. In like the 5 minutes we got left, I want to make sure that we touch on this moment too, because I'm sure what's going on is on everyone's minds. And so, John, for you, the federal government is pulling back in all different kinds of ways. We're looking at what the path forward is. When we talked earlier, you had a wonderful metaphor that I'll let you explain if you'd like, but this idea of a chessboard and where you look at the pieces. Can you just talk a little bit about what pieces you think we can put into play now, how you think about that?
Yeah, well, let me back up a little bit. For the last 30 years or so, at least the narrative I've heard a lot about climate change and the environment is, gosh, if we just vote for the right guys on election day, they'll be enlightened and virtuous and good, and they will do the right thing, and then they'll send the right representatives to the UN, and then they'll hold hands and save the world. And I'm like, well, how did that work out for us? Isn't that the definition of insanity? Just keep repeating the same thing and expecting a different result? So for 3-4 decades, we've been kind of hoping this kind of political class of enlightened people will save us. It hasn't worked out especially well. So I'm getting to look like when you play chess, there's an expression, see the whole board. So, okay, the bishop, the king, the queen, whatever, one of the pieces isn't working anymore. Maybe you lost it. Maybe it's in the wrong part of the board, whatever. Maybe it's just gone crazy. There are other pieces on the board. You don't give up the bloody game. In fact, you weren't playing it very well to begin with if you're only using one piece in one move. There's all sorts of pieces that work differently and have different moves. So I look at the whole chessboard and think, wait a minute, it turns out most of the stuff we do on climate change isn't just the federal and UN level policymakers. It's also business leaders and investors and philanthropists and most of all community leaders and activists and artists and just neighborhoods and households and communities. And we all have all these levers in front of us. How dare we just kind of give up on that and abdicate our responsibility to some, jet-setting crowd of diplomats that hopefully will have our best interest in mind. So let's play the whole chess game. And from opening gambit to checkmate, there's a whole lot of levers and a whole lot of pieces we haven't even begun to deploy. And that's where the game's going to be won.
And I love that metaphor. And I'm wondering, Nikhil, for you, when you look at reporting in the current Trump administration, how do you look at the chessboard, so to speak? What does it mean for your reporting?
Well, it's interesting because going into the Trump administration, I think we were really, obviously we had to focus on what was coming out of Washington and making sense of like what was important to report for people and how it was going to affect communities, because, we need to trace the end effects of like all of these policies. Like there are communities in Louisiana and Cancer Alley that are at more risk, in the coming years than they were even 6 months ago. At the same time, we were thinking of looking to state and local governments for progress, at least on the policy side. And Trump took a swipe at them, pretty recently at state and local climate laws, which I think is probably far beyond his jurisdiction and will get litigated in court. But you mentioned Cheaper, Faster, Better, which is the name of Tom Steyer's book that came out last year. And I interviewed him at the Texas Tribune Festival. And I said, okay, if Trump gets elected, what happens? More expensive, worse, slower? And he was like, no, the faster becomes slower. That's really the part that gets affected here. And so, yes, we have these laws on the books in New York State where they can go after fossil fuel companies for the damage that they're causing. And it's going to be held up in some litigation. Like the Trump administration is going to throw a roadblock against that, but it'll probably stand and they'll continue to be able to do it. Congestion pricing, same thing. The cap and trade issue here. We're going to be fighting for a lot of state and local laws that we're going to be part of the solution over the next 4 years. And then we also have to look at the fact that like the economics of all of this is at our back. The energy transition is going to happen because people whose shareholders care about it and whose bottom lines matter want to make sure their shareholders are happy and their bottom lines are healthy. And you can't bring back coal. Like, good luck.
Yeah.
So there's plenty for us to look at, and it's so important right now that we be tracking the solutions that are out there, the people who are developing them, the communities that are working on, that are deploying them, et cetera, because like people who care deeply about this issue, like they need to be seeing that progress has not halted.
And I think that's a great place to turn to our audience questions, because the first one is about misinformation. So we've got, thank you, first of all, everyone, for writing your questions. I have a few here that I'd like to read through. And I was peeking at this one while you were giving your answer, and I feel like it's the perfect opportunity, because showing people that progress also means dealing with a lot of misinformation. So the first question we've got here from Katrina is, what is your strategy to deal with misinformation? And how do you balance correcting falsehoods and not engaging with those who do not care about, it says poets here? Do not care about poets. But how do you deal with that misinformation? And poets, I suppose.
And poets, yeah.
I care about poets.
So the way that Grist...
Facts. Sorry.
Oh.
Facts. Sorry, Katrina.
I like facts too. Facts are good.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Both important.
Oh, now I can address this
Yeah,
question.
right.
Yeah, beforehand I was...
That was misinformation. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things that we realized a few years ago at Grist is that, we are a multi-platform publisher, whether we want to be or not. Grist has to have a meaningful presence. It can't just be at grist.org. It can't be our website. It has to be, we have to do events. We have to be on Instagram, TikTok, we have to play on Apple News. We have to syndicate, et cetera, et cetera. So there's sort of a pipeline at which you can address misinformation. We see our local news work and being able to get to people through more trusted, like non-political entities like New York Times, CNN, Fox News. These are political entities. If we get to you through the Macon Telegraph, you're less likely to attach some sort of political valence to it, and you're and you'll be reading something about your community. And so that is the inoculation phase. And the hope is that as you're reading that kind of work, you're being more and more educated. Then when you encounter misinformation in the wild, you're less likely to be persuaded by it. There's a second part where, our biggest Instagram post of the year was looking at the misinformation around the LA wildfires, and knocking down all sorts of rampant speculation that was going on, related to what was happening on the ground. And like 97% of the people who interacted with that post weren't Grist followers on Instagram. So we brought in like thousands of new people. I would argue that you can't do one and not the other. You have to do all of it, because sometimes when you go to social media to debunk something that's already out there, like it's too late, like it's already anchored. There's a reason that Bill Barr went out and gave his executive summary of the Mueller report before they released it, because he wanted to anchor reality.
And John, I want to bring this to you. How do you think about misinformation?
That's our number one job at Project Drawdown, is to be a source of true scientific information, and that means being the sworn enemy of disinformation, regardless of where it comes from. And that can be very uncomfortable sometimes, because there's very clearly a lot of disinformation from a entrenched kind of fossil fuel interest or big ag interest or whatever. That's the obvious ones. But even on the kind of climate side of things, there's also a lot of convenient fairy tales being told that just aren't true either. And so sometimes we have to call out our friends. And if we don't do that, then shame on us. Because there's only one North Star, and we have to follow it, and that is our North Star. It's just that speak truth to power wherever that power is, and so it can be really uncomfortable. But I think not only is climate under attack, science itself, facts itself, trusted voices themselves are under attack, and we cannot have a functioning democracy if we can't, agree on like laws of physics, or that the sun is in the sky, or the Earth is round. Really, it is. I'm going to die on that hill, and sometimes it'll cost some friends, but that's okay. And so that's what we do. That's what you do. This is what we all do here. And yet, that isn't really. I wish Americans, could come together on that. Like, facts do actually matter, and you can't just pick and choose the ones you like. And the left does it just as much as the right. We all do it. It's human nature a little bit to kind of conveniently ignore kind of bullshit if it agrees with something we kind of want to believe.
That kind of cognitive dissonance you're talking about.
Yeah, so let's check our assumptions at the door. Let's fact check ourselves most of all, and be a model of and admit when you're wrong.
Yeah.
Which I think is also really important. I think we need to bring integrity back to the conversation.
What do we do about all the poets? I'm kidding. So, Katrina, thank you for that question. The next one comes from Tony, who asks, to really break through the noise, what are some bold or underexplored strategies in storytelling that we can pursue? How can philanthropy, for example, support those? And John, I'd like to start with you with that one.
That would be great. I think philanthropy is so critical today, especially with government funding kind of disappearing and a lot of things for philanthropists. While it's kind of a smaller, only 2% of philanthropy right now focuses on climate change. That number needs to grow dramatically, but also to see the connections maybe between climate solutions and other things we care about. Whether, again, it's like communities and health and jobs and, security, all the, kind of kitchen table issues. How do we tell stories that connect to everyday folks? I think by making relatable stories about people like yourself, you can say, wow, that's somebody kind of like me doing something that benefits their community that's an awful lot like mine. Making this more relatable. Not having the superheroes of the world to save us from climate change, but seeing that the power to do so is really in our own hands every day. And the hands that are really going to save us from climate change probably have a little dirt under the fingernails and a little grease on their on their shirt. And I'd like to tell those stories, the people who are the unsung everyday heroes.
And Nikhil, I'll give you the last word here. What do you think about that?
I think one of the big issues is, and it goes back to this whole idea of local. So there's one thing, let me say, beyond local, there's a great service that philanthropy can do to match organizations that they care about who are putting out information that is critical and helping match that with people in the influencer sphere who can help disseminate it, like a CAA meets, Ford Foundation kind of, creative agency. I think that's one piece that's one thing that I think could exist. But on the other part, I think to go back to this whole idea of inoculation and local and making things relatable, one of the things that we have started doing at Grist, because we have done so much reporting on environmental justice and climate justice over the years, is going into communities, doing listening sessions, reporting with communities instead of simply on them. And that introduces you to this completely new sphere of influencers who's the person who owns a particular store, the person who's everybody's connected to on Facebook. And if you get them information, it disseminates around a community. And you start to learn these completely different patterns by which people get information. We can't be everywhere, so we have to sort of pick and choose and respond to things. So we deployed into Western North Carolina after Hurricane Helene and developed pamphlets that were helpful to all sorts of people in trying to figure out how to access FEMA aid, et cetera, et cetera. So if you can make connections with people, if you can tell them information that they need, you gain trust that then they will come to you later. And I think giving people the power to be able to make those more direct connections is going to be so important moving forward.
Yeah, direct.
And I would just say it's the same way with politics. All politics is national. We need to bring it back to all politics is local and go from the bottom up.
So for a global problem, focus on the local and the direct connections. Yeah. This has been so wonderful. Jonathan Foley, Executive Director of Project Drawdown, and Nikhil Swaminathan, the CEO of Grist. Thank you both so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.